Before we begin, let me give you a warning. Some stories fade because no one bothers to remember them. This isn't one of those stories. This one survived because someone with reach, someone with resources, has been working very hard to make sure you never hear it. And yet, here you are, listening, which means that in the next few minutes, you're going to learn something most people will never know. Something you may wish you could unhear. It started in the summer of 1847, in the modest little town of Culpeper, Virginia, a place where life moved at the speed of a horse's trot, and nothing truly remarkable ever seemed to happen. The air was thick with the smell of pine from the surrounding hills. The streets, a scatter of brick storefronts and whitewashed houses. People knew each other's names, their children's birthdays, even the sound of each other's footsteps on the wooden boardwalks. Sheriff Elias Torres had walked those streets for years, a man of quiet authority who knew when to step in and when to let small quarrels burn themselves out. He'd dealt with his share of petty thefts, drunken brawls, and livestock gone astray. But nothing, not a single thing in his years of service, had prepared him for the day the Culpeper Twins came home. Sarah and Samuel Culpeper. If you've never heard their names before, that's not surprising. Someone made sure of it. But ask anyone who lived in Culpeper back then, and they'd tell you the twins were different even before the strange things happened. Bright, almost unnaturally so. Gifted with a way of speaking that made grown men hesitate before disagreeing. Some people whispered that they could predict things before they happened. Others thought it was just the way they watched you. Those twin pairs of calm, unblinking eyes that seemed to peel you apart, layer by layer. Then, 10 years before that summer, they were gone. No goodbyes, no witnesses, no tracks to follow. And soon after their disappearance, the vanishings began. Townsfolk, a few at first, then more, all without explanation. It was the kind of mystery that left a bruise on a place. People stopped talking about it out loud, but you could still see the questions in their eyes. By 1847, most folks had quietly decided the twins were either dead or somewhere far away, doing whatever strange people do when they leave the world behind. Until that morning, Torres was standing outside the general store, coffee in hand, when they appeared. Not from the woods, not from the hills, just there at the far end of Main Street, walking side by side like they'd only been gone an afternoon. They looked clothes that looked neither new nor worn, as if the years themselves had politely stepped aside. What would you do if you saw that? You'd stare. You'd freeze. You'd try to remember the last time you saw their faces. And you'd fail, because the moment you looked at them, the years between simply dissolved. The townsfolk didn't cheer or rush forward. They didn't even speak. They just stood on the sidewalks, watching in absolute silence as Sarah and Samuel passed. And if you'd been close enough, you have noticed something else. The twins weren't watching the crowd. They were scanning it. Their eyes darted from person to person, like they were searching for someone or something. When they reached the courthouse steps, they stopped, turned to face the gathered crowd, and they smiled, but not the warm, neighborly kind of smile. This was precise, controlled, the way a chess player smiles. Just Torres felt it first, that low, almost electric hum in the air. Not a sound exactly, but a sensation. His fingers tightened around his coffee cup without realizing it. Something in him wanted to speak, to demand answers, but the words stayed stuck in his throat. The twins didn't explain where they'd been. They didn't mention the people who'd vanished. They just existed there for a moment, then turned and walked into the courthouse without invitation. Later, Torres would try to tell himself it was just the shock of seeing them again, that there was nothing strange about it. Not really. But deep down, he knew better. Everyone did. The Culpeper Twins had returned, and with them, the quiet certainty that whatever had taken them away was about to reach for the rest of the town. Less than 6 weeks later, Culpeper would be unrecognizable, and every report, every testimony, every fragile scrap of truth about what happened in those weeks would vanish from public record, locked away where no one could find it. But here you are, about to hear the story that someone spent more than a century trying to bury. If you keep listening, if you let this story into your mind, you may never look at small towns or familiar faces quite the same way again. If you had wandered into Culpeper that summer, before everything began to twist, you'd have sworn it was a postcard someone forgot to mail. The streets ran in straight, sensible lines. White clapboard homes sat behind neat, split-rail fences. Laundry hung in the warm breeze, snapping softly, like it had all the time in the world. The courthouse bell marked the hours, and the scent of fresh bread from Miss Hawthorne's bakery drifted down Main Street, just in time for the morning rush. On the surface, nothing in this town seemed unusual, but Culpeper had a way of holding its breath when it needed to, as if the whole place could agree, silently, that certain topics were best left untouched. The twins were one of those topics. Sheriff Torres felt that shift more keenly than most. He had always trusted patterns, the rhythm of familiar conversations, the predictability of who'd stroll past his office at what time of day. But in the week after Sarah and Samuel's return, those patterns began to warp. People still nodded hello, but the smiles didn't reach their eyes. Conversations stopped when he walked into a room, replaced by a brittle kind of silence. It was in that strained quiet that Dr. Charles Fairfax returned to town. A tall, spare man, with hair the color of frost, and the posture of someone who'd spent more years reading than sleeping. Fairfax was the sort who noticed everything and spoke only when he'd already decided the room deserved his opinion. He'd been away for over a year, traveling to Philadelphia and Boston on research matters he never quite defined. But now, as he stepped off the stagecoach with a single leather case, it was clear his absence hadn't made him any less intimidating. Fairfax was one of the few people in Culpeper who'd ever got as children. They'd visited his study more than once, fascinated by his cabinets of oddities, pinned insects, antique instruments, mineral samples that glowed faintly under lamplight. He never said so directly, but Torres always suspected Fairfax knew more about their disappearance than he admitted. On the other end of town, Timothy Caraway swept the dust from his father's blacksmith shop, watching the world go by in the same patient way a fisherman watches the tide. Timothy was 17, all lanky limbs and restless energy, too young to remember the twins clearly before they vanished, but old enough now to sense that something about their return was off. His father told him to keep his head down. That's sheriff business. But Timothy's curiosity didn't take orders easily. The air itself seemed to change that week. Mornings came later, somehow, with the sun hesitating before cresting the hills. Even the crickets fell quiet earlier than usual, as though the night had lost its appetite for sound. Torres noticed small things first. Shop doors locking a little earlier, lights burning longer behind drawn curtains, mothers walking their children home from school in tight-lipped silence. It wasn't fear exactly. Not yet. It was the kind of collective unease that makes a town listen more closely to the creak of its own floorboards. Fairfax wasted no time before visiting Torres. "I hear they've returned," he said without preamble, standing in the doorway of the sheriff's office. His voice was calm, but his eyes carried that sharp, clinical interest Torres remembered from years before. "They have," Torres replied, leaning back in his chair. And nothing," Torres said. "They won't say where they've been. They won't say anything at all." Fairfax stepped inside, setting his leather case on the desk. "Then we're running out of time," he murmured. It was such an odd statement that Torres almost asked what he meant. Almost. But before he could, Fairfax was already walking away, leaving the scent of old books and pipe tobacco in his wake. Meanwhile, Timothy spotted the twins himself 2 days later. They were standing at the edge of the river, side by side, their reflections rippling in the current. They didn't look up when he approached, but the hair on the back of his neck rose anyway, as if they'd noticed him without turning. And just like that, Culpeper felt smaller, the streets narrower, the spaces between people tighter but not warmer. It was the kind of change you couldn't name without sounding foolish, yet everyone, in their own way, sensed it. What they didn't know was that this was only the first ripple, and that the real storm was already moving quietly toward them. In small towns, real trouble doesn't announce itself. It doesn't roll in with drums and thunder. It slips through the cracks, wearing the same face as an ordinary day, until you notice the details have shifted. For Sheriff Torres, that shift arrived on a Wednesday evening, just as the sun sank into the hills. He was closing the shutters on his office when the sound reached him. 3 sharp knocks on the front door. Not the hesitant tap of a neighbor. Not the impatient pounding of a drunk. This was deliberate, precise. Standing on the porch was a farmhand named Henry Cobb, pale as flour and clutching his hat like it might blow away. "Sheriff," he began, his voice tight. It's Mrs. Doherty's boy. He ain't come home." Now, a missing child in Culpeper wasn't unheard of. Sometimes they wandered into the woods, chasing squirrels or pretending to be soldiers. But Henry's eyes told a different story. They weren't worried eyes. They were hollow. Like he'd already seen the ending and didn't want to speak it aloud. Torres followed him to the Doherty homestead, a modest clapboard house with a garden patch out front. The mother, Clara Doherty, was standing in the doorway, wringing her hands. She'd sent her boy, Jacob, to fetch water from the well before supper. That had been nearly 2 hours ago. No one had seen him since. The sheriff asked the usual questions. Which way did he go? Was anyone with him? Had she noticed anything strange in the days before? Clara shook her head, but her voice kept catching, like there was something she couldn't bring herself to say. Torres searched the well first. Empty, save for the cold glint of water at the bottom. Then the yard. Then the stretch of woods that pressed up against the back of the property. He found no tracks, no sign of a struggle. Nothing but the soft layer of pine needles and the sound of his own breathing. When he returned to the house, Dr. Fairfax was there. No one had sent for him, yet somehow he'd arrived before Torres could even decide to. "I heard," Fairfax said simply, and stepped past the sheriff into the dimly lit kitchen. "Henry said the boy never came back from the well," Torres told him. "I know," Fairfax replied, glancing at Clara. "But that's not the part she's afraid to tell you." Clara's hands froze mid-ring. She swallowed hard. "They were here," she whispered. "Who?" Torres asked. "The twins." The room seemed to contract around the word. Clara said she'd seen them standing at the edge of the garden not long before Jacob vanished. They hadn't spoken, hadn't moved toward her, just stood there, watching. And then, as quickly as she'd spotted them, they were gone. Fairfax's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. "You should search the river," he told Torres. "If you find nothing, you should search it again." By the time Torres reached the riverbank, Timothy was already there. The boy had been fishing with a friend when he spotted something caught in the reeds. Jacob's water pail, dented on one side. No footprints led to it. No sign of where the boy might have gone. The sheriff and Timothy walked the bank for nearly a mile in both directions, the twilight pressing in, heavier by the minute. And then, just as Torres was about to call it off for the night, they saw them, Sarah and Samuel, standing in the shallows, water lapping at their ankles, perfectly still. Their faces were unreadable in the fading light. "Jacob Doherty," Torres called out, his voice steady but edged with steel. "Where is he?" The twins turned their heads in perfect unison, meeting his gaze with an expression that was almost amused. Sarah tilted her head, and it chilled him more than silence ever could. They stepped out of the water, passing between him and Timothy without so much as brushing against them. Neither turned to look back. That night, the town gathered in the square. Clara wept quietly on her porch, while neighbors whispered in clusters, casting nervous glances toward the courthouse. Jacob Doherty was never found. Torres sat alone in his office, the dented water pail on his desk. He turned it over in his hands, wondering not where the boy had gone, but whether he'd ever been in Culpeper at all by the time the twins returned. Because deep down, he knew this wasn't the beginning of something strange. It was the continuation of something that had never ended. You can hide one disappearance in a small town. People will fold it into the fabric of old gossip and whispered half-truths until it frays at the edges. But 2 disappearances? 3? That's when the threads start snapping, and everyone can hear it. It began a week after Jacob Doherty was gone. Then another boy, Adam Greeley, failed to return from delivering milk to the Fairfax estate. A day later, Mary Cobb, Henry's younger sister, vanished while walking home from church. Each time, the same impossible details surfaced. Someone had seen the twins nearby, and each time, the twins claimed nothing, or worse, they said nothing at all. Sheriff Torres wasn't sleeping much by then. His desk was covered with maps of Culpeper, circles drawn around the last known locations of each missing child. The circles weren't random. They formed an odd crescent shape, curling toward the river. Torres stared at it for hours, chewing on the possibility that the river wasn't just a place to search, but a boundary. Dr. Fairfax studied the same map one evening, leaning over the sheriff's desk like a school teacher inspecting a hopeless essay. "You're still looking for tracks," he said. "When patterns?" Torres asked. "Time of day, direction of travel, who saw them last, and what those people felt when they did." Torres frowned. "Felt?" Fairfax looked up, his eyes narrowing. "You've seen it, Elias. The twins don't just appear in places. They appear in moments. Moments when someone is alone, when no one else is watching. They don't take in front of witnesses. That's deliberate. That's curated." Meanwhile, Timothy had taken it upon himself to watch the twins. It wasn't official. Torres would have told him to stay out of it. But the boy's restless nature didn't mix well with orders to keep his head down. He shadowed them from a distance, scribbling notes in a little leather-bound book. Times, places, who they looked at, who they didn't. It was during one of these quiet stakeouts that Timothy saw something he didn't fully understand. Sarah Culpeper, standing in the schoolyard at dusk, staring at the blackboard through the window as the teacher wiped away the day's lessons. Not moving, not blinking. And Samuel, a few paces away, whispering something under his breath to no one at all. Torres's own investigation led him to the old parish records. There, in spidery handwriting, he found the official statement from a decade earlier, the day the twins first vanished. It was brief, too brief. The only witness at the time had been Dr. Charles Fairfax. When Torres confronted him, Fairfax didn't deny it. "I was the last to see them," he admitted, "but I wasn't the only one they visited." "Visited where?" Torres pressed. Fairfax hesitated. "Not here," he said finally. "In some ways, not anywhere you can reach with a map." The disappearances continued. Not daily, not predictably, but enough to keep the town simmering. Doors were locked in the middle of the afternoon. The bakery stopped opening altogether. And yet, no one dared confront the twins directly. Part of it was fear, the deep, ancestral kind that warns you not to look a predator in the eye. But part of it was something else. A strange pull. More than one person, when asked later, admitted they'd felt compelled to trust the twins, to stand still when they should have run, to believe without question when Samuel would say, "Everything's fine." Torres couldn't shake the thought that whatever this was, it wasn't just physical. It was in people's minds. So he turned to Timothy. "You're the only one they don't seem to notice," he told him. "I need you closer." The boy nodded, a mix of pride and fear in his expression. "How close?" "Close enough to hear what they're not saying," Torres replied. The next evening, Timothy followed the twins into the woods beyond the river. He kept low, moving from shadow to shadow, his notebook clutched to his chest. They walked without speaking for nearly a mile, before stopping in a small clearing. There, Samuel knelt and began to draw something in the dirt. A series of interlocking circles and lines that looked nothing like letters. Sarah stood nearby, her gaze fixed on the tree line, as though she already knew Timothy was there. And maybe she did, because just as Timothy leaned forward for a better look, Sarah smiled. Not warmly, not kindly, just a thin, knowing curve of her lips before she turned back to her brother. When Timothy returned to Torres, his notebook shaking in his hands, the drawing was already burned into his memory. Fairfax took one look at the sketch and went pale. "I've seen this before," he said quietly. "Where?" Torres asked. Fairfax's eyes flicked. "There's a difference between knowing you're in danger and knowing exactly what kind of danger you're in. The first leaves you cautious. The second, it changes how you breathe, how you move, how you think." For Sheriff Torres, that change began the moment Dr. Fairfax spoke the next words. "I saw that symbol," Fairfax said, tapping Timothy's shaky sketch, "the night before the first disappearance, 10 years ago." He told it like a confession he'd rehearsed for a decade. How he'd been called to the old mill on the north bank of the river, not for a patient, but for a meeting. Waiting for him there had been the twins, younger then, but no less unsettling. And on the mill floor, drawn in chalk, had been the same interlocking circles and lines. They asked me to stand inside it, Fairfax said quietly. Said they wanted to show me something. Torres leaned forward. And Fairfax's eyes, one moment, I was in the mill. The next, I was somewhere else. No sound, no sky, just a gray field that went on forever. And the feeling, he stopped, his voice thinning, the feeling that someone was standing right behind me. He never saw who. He never wanted to. The next thing he remembered, he was back in the mill, the chalk lines smeared, as if someone had dragged their foot through them. And by morning, the Culpeper Twins were gone. Timothy, sitting in the corner, was pale but alert. That's what they were doing in the woods, he said. Drawing that thing. Maybe they're planning to take someone else there. Or bring something back, Fairfax murmured. That was when Torres made the decision that would alter everything. We're going to the mill, he said. The mill had been abandoned for years, its wheel frozen in place, its walls warped by weather. But as the three of them approached, they saw fresh signs of life. And the air inside was cold, unnaturally so for late summer. And on the warped wooden floor, in almost the exact same spot Fairfax had described, the symbol had been drawn again. This time not in chalk, but in something darker, glistening faintly in the dim light. Blood. It hadn't dried yet. Torres scanned the corners of the room, hand on his revolver. If they're here, they're not, Fairfax cut in. Not exactly. He crouched, tracing a finger just above the lines, careful not to touch them. This is active, like an open door. Timothy stood at the edge, eyes wide. A door to where? Fairfax didn't answer. Or maybe he didn't know. Then came the sound, faint, distant, but clear enough to freeze all three in place. A voice, a child's voice. Sheriff? It was Jacob Doherty. The voice was coming from the center of the symbol. Torres' instincts screamed to step forward, but Fairfax's hand shot out. If you cross that line, you may not come back, he warned. A voice called again, more desperate this time. Sheriff, please! Timothy, shaking, whispered, It's a trick. It has to be. But Torres's gut was torn in two. Every lawman's oath demanded he act. Every primal instinct told him to stay exactly where he was. That's when they heard a second voice. Not a child's, not human. It spoke only one word, low and resonant enough to rattle the boards under their feet. Stay. The sound hit Torres like a physical weight, pressing against his chest. Fairfax staggered back, his face drained of color. And Timothy swore later he saw a shadow pass behind them, even though the mill's door was shut. The voices faded. The cold air lifted. But the symbol remained, untouched, gleaming in that impossible way. Torres holstered his revolver with deliberate slowness. We're not telling the town about this, he said. Not yet. I know, Torres replied. That's exactly what I'm afraid of. That night, the sheriff sat in his office, long after the lamps burned low. The dented water pail still sat in the corner, a mute reminder of how it all began. But now there was something new in his mind. The voice. That one unshakable word. He couldn't decide if it had been a warning or an invitation. Either way, the path forward was clear. The twins were not just witnesses. They were the center of the storm, and if Torres wanted to save Culpeper, he'd have to walk straight into it. By the third week, the disappearances stopped. Not because the twins were gone, far from it, but because they seemed to no longer need to hide. Sarah and Samuel were everywhere, at the edge of the market, standing in the churchyard, lingering just beyond the lamplight on Main Street, always watching. To the townsfolk, it was worse than the vanishings. You could avoid danger when it was invisible, pretend it wasn't there. But when danger starts smiling at you in the daylight, you realize you've been living in its shadow all along. Sheriff Torres knew the quiet was only a pause. And pauses, in his experience, meant someone was deciding when to make the next move. He wasn't going to give them that luxury. It happened on a Thursday evening. The air was heavy, still carrying the warmth of the day, but the streets were already deserted. Torres had arranged it that way, knocking on doors, telling families to stay inside, no matter what they heard. He found the twins near the old schoolhouse. Samuel was leaning against the wall, idly tossing a pebble into the dust. Sarah stood a few feet away, her gaze tilted upward at the bell tower, like she was listening for a sound only she could hear. "Samuel, Sarah," Torres said, voice low but steady. They both turned in perfect unison, that same unsettling symmetry that made them look less like siblings and more like reflections. "Sheriff," Samuel replied, "out for a walk?" "Not a walk," Torres said. "A conversation." Sarah smiled faintly. "Conversations are dangerous in Culpeper these days." "That depends on what you're hiding," Torres shot back. For a moment, neither twin spoke. Then Samuel straightened and stepped forward. "You've been looking where you shouldn't," he said. "The mill, the river, the lines on the floor." "I've been looking where people keep disappearing," Torres countered. "You show up, they vanish. I want to know why." Samuel tilted his head. "Want or need?" The way he said it, like the words were keys, and Torres was already halfway through the door without realizing, made something crawl under the sheriff's skin. They didn't move when he drew his revolver. They didn't flinch. In fact, Sarah took a slow step closer. "Guns won't help," she said softly. "You felt it, haven't you? That pull, that belonging." Torres's grip tightened. "Belonging to what?" Samuel smiled. "Not what, where." He reached into his coat and pulled out something small, Timothy's notebook. Torres's stomach dropped. "Your little shadow was clever," Samuel said, flipping it open. "But clever isn't enough when you don't understand the rules." "Where is he?" Torres demanded. "Not far," Sarah murmured. "Not yet." Torres could feel it now. the same chill from the mill, bleeding into the warm evening air. It was radiating from them, curling around his thoughts. His instincts screamed to back away, to shut this down. But another part of him leaned in, hungry for whatever truth they were offering. He fought it. "You're going to take me to him. Now." "You'll see him," Samuel said. "But once you step inside, you don't get to choose what you bring back." Before Torres could react, Sarah lifted her hand and traced a shape in the air, the same interlocking circles Timothy had drawn. And without touching a single surface, the lines began to shimmer in the dust between them. The space inside the shape darkened, like a shadow where there shouldn't be one. And then, movement. Figures shifting just beyond the surface. Torres's breath caught. One of them was Timothy. He was standing in that gray, endless field Fairfax had described. His mouth moved, calling out, but no sound reached through. Behind him, something vast loomed, formless, but impossibly tall. "Step through," Sarah whispered. Every muscle in Torres's body tensed. He knew, without proof, without reason, that if he crossed that threshold, he might never come back. And yet, Timothy's wide, terrified eyes locked on his, silently begging him to act. He lowered his gun, not because he trusted them, but because he needed both hands free. With one step, he crossed the line. The world dropped away. No sound, no sky, just the endless field and the weight of something watching from behind. He could feel it now. Not eyes, not breath, but attention. Ancient, patient. Timothy's voice broke through, small and choked. "Sheriff." A shadow passed between them. The twins' voices followed, overlapping, echoing from everywhere at once. "Choose." And that was the moment Torres understood. He could leave with Timothy, or with answers, but not both. The return was not a step, it was a tear, a sudden, violent wrenching, as if the world itself had decided it no longer wanted him where he was. One heartbeat, Torres was in the gray expanse, the weight of that watching presence pressing down on his spine. The next, he was stumbling into the dusty street outside the old schoolhouse, coughing, shivering in the warm night air. Timothy wasn't with him. The twins stood exactly where they had been. Sarah tilted her head, studying him the way a collector might inspect a rare coin. "You chose," she said. Torres's throat tightened. "You let him go." Samuel's smile was small, almost gentle. "We don't let go, Sheriff. We trade. And you've just taken something far more valuable than a boy." Before he could demand answers, before he could even take a step, they were gone. No sound, no trail, just the fading echo of their voices in his mind. Choose. The next morning, the town looked the same. The market bustled. Horses clopped lazily along Main Street. The blacksmith's hammer rang in steady rhythm. But it was all too normal, like a painting hung in front of something rotting just out of sight. Torres didn't go to the station. He went to the river. sat on the bank until the sun was high, staring at the water as if it might change, as if it might tell him what he'd brought back, because he had brought something. It was small at first, the way people would pause when passing him, their eyes lingering just a moment too long. The way dogs he'd known for years now refused to come near, growling low in their throats. The way, in the deepest part of the night, he'd hear a second set of footsteps pacing his floorboards, matching his own. And then there were the dreams, gray, endless, silent, always the same, always standing in that strange field, except now he could feel the thing behind him. Closer every time. Dr. Fairfax visited a week later. He didn't ask where Timothy was, didn't press for details about the mill, or the symbols, or the twins. He only said, "You've been marked, Elias. It doesn't matter what you saw. It matters that you looked." Torres didn't argue. He just poured 2 glasses of whiskey, and they drank. No one saw them. No one spoke their names aloud. Yet their presence pressed down on Culpeper like a storm cloud that never broke. The townsfolk began to whisper again, about the sheriff's eyes, about the way he seemed to know when someone was about to fall ill, or when a fight was about to break out before it started. Some said it was instinct. Others said it was the twins, watching through him. Torres stopped sleeping. He stopped writing in his logbook, and most nights he found himself standing at the edge of the woods without remembering how he got there. The taste of cold metal in his mouth, the faint shape of interlocking circles burned into his vision. One night, weeks later, he woke to a knock on his door. It was a young boy from the edge of town, shivering in the doorway. "Sheriff, my sister's gone. Can you help?" Torres opened his mouth to answer, to say yes, to grab his coat and his revolver and head straight into the night, but stopped. Because over the boy's shoulder, at the far end of the road, 2 still figures stood in the dark. Sarah and Samuel, waiting. He didn't move. He didn't call out. He just stood there, the boy's voice growing small in his ears, and wondered what they wanted him to do this time. Save the girl, or keep the peace. Because maybe Fairfax had been right. Maybe it wasn't about what you saw, but about the moment you realized you'd become part of their story. In the years that followed, Culpeper's records of that summer would vanish. Pages torn from ledgers, witnesses moving away, even Timothy's name fading from memory like a word left too long in the sun. But sometimes, late at night, Torres would wake with that single word ringing in his head: choose. And every time, he'd wonder, had he made the right choice? Or was the real question something far worse? What if they hadn't given him one at all?